Generation Z is the most connected, most informed, and arguably the most politically aware cohort in American history. And yet it is also the generation that trusts Washington the least. A mere 2 in 10 Americans today say they trust the federal government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. When young Americans watch the halls of Congress gridlock, observe corporate money flooding elections, or see decades-old figures still calling the shots, it's no wonder the trust crisis is deepening. In this video, we're going to unpack why this trust crisis matters, how it shapes the future of U.S. democracy, and what it means for your generation. Welcome to Youth in Politics, the channel where we bring you clear, no-spin analysis of U.S. politics from the viewpoint of today's young Americans. If you care about real change rather than empty promises, join us as we dig beneath the headlines and ask the tough questions. Now, let's start by looking at one of the biggest issues facing U.S. democracy: the trust crisis. Trust in U.S. federal institutions has been eroding for decades, and recent polling shows we are at or near historic lows. According to the Pew Research Center in June 2024, just 22% of Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do what is right most of the time or always. That same research notes a majority, 59%, believe the government only does the right thing some of the time, and 17% say never. Congress in particular is viewed unfavorably by the public. A Pew snapshot in 2023 found that 72% of Americans held an unfavorable view of Congress, while just 26% said they viewed it favorably. For younger Americans, the figures can be even starker. A recent poll found only about 18% of people aged 18 to 29 trust Congress. The implications of such widespread mistrust are profound. When citizens don't believe the institutions in their country are responsive or legitimate, the foundations of democracy begin to wobble. Legitimacy, the belief that the system is just and worthy of support, is a currency of democracy. Without it, political apathy rises, extremist alternatives become more attractive, and governance becomes harder. Why is this crisis happening now? Several factors converge: dramatic partisan polarization, the sense that government serves elites, not everyday people, constant media coverage of failures and scandals, and generational change in how people access information and engage politically. For example, as one analysis shows, confidence in Congress dropped by roughly 45 percentage points from the 1970s to the 2010s. We also see that local governments enjoy much higher trust than federal institutions. According to a Gallup survey, 67% of Americans trust local government to handle local problems, whereas only 32% trust the legislative branch of the federal government. That gap underscores how distance, scale, and perceptions of being unheard feed the trust deficit. In short, the trust crisis is real, it is deep, and for young Americans, the stakes are higher. If trust continues to fall, the system that holds us together may no longer serve as the center of political life, and that means change, whether peaceful or disruptive, is coming. Why Gen Z feels left out? It's not just that young Americans don't trust institutions, it's that they feel excluded from them. For members of Generation Z, roughly born 1997 to 2012, issues such as student debt, high housing costs, climate change, and economic precarity dominate, yet they see a federal government and Congress that appear unresponsive. According to a Harvard Youth poll in spring 2025, just 15% of young Americans believed the country was heading in the right direction, and fewer than 1/3 approved of either party in Congress. Gen Z internalizes some of that exclusion. They see older politicians, entrenched power, and feel their timelines are ignored. One survey found that while Gen Z strongly supports democratic principles, for example, 80% agree fair laws are essential, they express low confidence in how the system is actually working for them. When a generation enters adulthood facing a job market disrupted by pandemic and automation, widespread student debt and housing cost inflation, it's no surprise they view politics through a lens of frustration. In a Gen Forward 2024 survey, 42% of Black young voters, 33% of AAPI, 42% of Latinx, and 40% of white Gen Z said they did not trust local, state, or federal government. To young Americans, political promises feel out of touch. On climate especially, youth might see Congress approve large military budgets and tax breaks for corporations while they struggle with rent and student loans. On social media and in campus halls, they register the disconnect. Lawmakers debating decades-old frameworks while young people live in existential deadlines. The result is a generation that feels politically homeless, believing in democracy's ideals but not seeing them realized in their lives. When you feel you are excluded, you disengage. You skip voting. You tune out debates. You may even explore alternative forms of civic participation. The risk is that feeling left out morphs into either apathy or radical response, which brings us to the next section: the age and culture gap between Congress and youth. Another major factor: there is a significant age and culture gap between the people who make U.S. laws and the people they're supposed to represent. According to the latest data, the median age of voting members of the House of Representatives is 57.5 years. The Senate's median age is 64.7 years. Furthermore, in the current 119th Congress, 39% of House members are baby boomers and only 15% are millennials. Generation Z effectively holds near zero representation. What does this age gap imply in daily politics? For one, priorities differ. Younger generations tend to care more about climate action, student debt relief, tech regulation, wage stagnation, and housing affordability, issues that older lawmakers may regard as secondary. Meanwhile, older cohorts may focus more on social security, defense budgets, legacy policy frameworks, and partisan positioning. Culture differences go further than just age. Generation Z and younger millennials have grown up post-internet, post-9/11, often in times of economic instability and globalization. Their communication styles, their reference points, their media consumption patterns differ radically from the legislators whose formative years were the Cold War and analog television. This mismatch means lawmakers often struggle to speak the language of younger voters, and younger voters feel misunderstood. There's also the phenomenon of symbolic gestures versus real inclusion. A member of Congress may reference TikTok, social media activism, or youth concerns, but if policy remains unchanged, the gesture rings hollow. The gap is not just generational, but institutional. When youth feel like the system wasn't built for them, every pause in action becomes a reminder of exclusion. The ramifications: when you look at Congress and don't see people like you, don't hear people like you, you begin to question whether it's your failed civic instincts or the system's failure. For many young Americans, it's the latter. And when that becomes the narrative, trust erodes further, and the democratic contract weakens. Money, lobbying, and gridlock in Congress contribute heavily to the trust crisis. Power concentrated in lobbyists, corporate PACs, party leadership, and entrenched committees make many young Americans feel that politics is not a public service, but a pay-to-play game. Numerous investigations show that legislation is often influenced more by major donors and interest groups than average voters. Meanwhile, legislative gridlock and partisan dysfunction amplify frustration. Data from the Pew Research Center shows that views of Congress have further declined. Only 34% of Americans had a favorable view of Congress as of early 2025, up slightly from 30%, but still deeply low. The sense that Congress cannot or will not act fuels the feeling that nothing will change, and therefore nothing is to be trusted. Money's influence becomes visible when one examines who runs for office, who gets elected, and how legislation is written. The dominance of wealthy donors and interest groups means that for many young Americans, appealing to Congress feels like appealing to the 1%. Thus, political disillusionment takes root. If you can't afford access, you may feel your vote or voice doesn't count. The gridlock is not simply about rivalry between parties, it's about a system built for compromise, yet hamstrung by hyperpolarization, rigid leadership, and institutional inertia. When bills on topics young people care about stall or die in committee, those youth see proof positive. Congress isn't responsive. This combination, moneyed influence, unresponsive systems, and visible stagnation, all erode not just individual confidence, but civic faith. The logic to younger Americans starts to sound like, why should I trust a system that seems rigged, slow, and indifferent to my generation's fate? And the answer is, no wonder so many are stepping back. At this point, we arrive at a pivotal question. Are young Americans